Smoke poured from his dreams, curling into the sky like a cruel elegy for everything he'd built. But it was the fire in their laughter that burned deeper. Jamal Rivers, a man who had spent a decade shaping a quiet corner of hope, now crouched on the sidewalk outside his store, his sanctuary, reduced to nothing but flame and ash. His hands covered his face not just to block out the heat, but to shield himself from the sound of Officer Rick Mathers laughing just feet away. The crackling fire behind him roared like a beast, but it was the silence between their worlds that screamed the loudest. No sirens, no empathy, just smoke, heat, and a badge worn like armor against accountability. Yet, what Mathers didn't know was that someone else stood across the street. Still, watching, recording, and with that quiet, unseen decision, everything would change. Wherever you're watching from, drop your city in the comments, because what you're about to hear, you'll never forget. Jamal Rivers was 34, with quiet eyes and hands shaped by labor and love. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or seek attention. He believed in building, in showing up, in doing things the hard way if it meant they would last. Rivers & Sons wasn't just a bookstore. It was his father's dream, and his own salvation. The small shop on the corner of Rosemont Avenue stood beneath a faded awning, with hand-painted windows and shelves full of stories the world tried to forget. His father, Walter Rivers, had marched in the civil rights movement, taught Jamal that knowledge was resistance, that words carried the weight of revolutions. The bookstore became more than a business. It was a sanctuary, a classroom, a gathering space for voices that had long been silenced. But even sanctuaries aren't immune to shadows. Every day, Jamal walked a thin line between dignity and exhaustion. He poured himself into his work, reading sessions for kids, late-night inventory checks, fundraisers to keep the lights on. And yet, there was always a tension that followed him. The sideways glances when he made bank deposits, the unsolicited patrol car parked outside his store after closing. He carried it all in silence, like armor he didn't ask for. Some days, he wondered if his calm demeanor made it easier for people to pretend racism had left this corner of California untouched. Officer Rick Mathers had patrolled the neighborhood for over 2 decades. His hair was thinning, his uniform pressed, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Once, he might have cared about protecting people, but time had hardened him. He spoke in clipped phrases, dismissed complaints with casual disdain, and carried himself with the kind of certainty that comes from never being questioned. What no one saw was the insecurity beneath his authority, a man who saw progress as a threat and visibility as a challenge to his control. Jamal represented everything Mathers resented: quiet confidence, community respect, and a business that didn't depend on permission from men like him. Outside, the palm trees swayed gently, under the golden sun, their shadows spilling across sidewalks like lazy brushstrokes. The air smelled faintly of salt and street tacos, and for a moment the neighborhood looked peaceful. But inside Jamal, the pressure was mounting. The warmth of the setting clashed with the cold truth he lived. California sunshine couldn't bleach out what still lurked beneath the surface. The bookstore, with its worn wooden counters and carefully stacked volumes, stood as a symbol of hope, of generational strength. But even symbols could be vandalized. Even sacred places could be turned to ash. And beneath all that sunlight something was already shifting. Quietly, steadily. as if the story that had been bound within those bookstore walls was preparing to turn its final, fiery page. The morning air was cool when Jamal arrived, the kind of calm that usually gave him a moment of peace before unlocking the doors to the world he had built. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, that peace shattered. Across the front window of Rivers and Sons, thick red spray paint screamed in jagged letters, slurs, insults, and venomous phrases that made his stomach twist. He stood frozen, keys still in his hand, heart sinking deeper than he thought it could. This place wasn't just a store. It was memory, legacy, refuge, and now it had been marked like a target. He swallowed hard, fingers trembling as he pulled out his phone and called the police. A part of him hoped for help, for someone to show up and say this wasn't okay, but another part, the louder one, braced for something colder. 2 patrol cars pulled up within minutes. Officer Rick Mathers stepped out, adjusting his belt like he owned the block. His partner, younger and silent, followed behind. Mathers approached the storefront, looked at the graffiti, and smirked. "Guess someone finally gave their opinion on your literature," he said with a shrug, his voice dry and laced with condescension. Jamal blinked, stunned, then straightened his spine. "I'd like a report filed," he said calmly. "This is a hate crime." Mathers chuckled and glanced back at his partner. "Hate's a strong word. Maybe just strong criticism." The partner muttered under his breath, "Waste of ink," loud enough to sting. Jamal clenched his jaw, his face blank but burning inside. They left without taking a statement. Just a nod, a smirk, and the faint sound of a car door slamming shut. That night, the call came around midnight. A neighbor panicked. Flames. Smoke. His store. Jamal didn't remember grabbing his keys or leaving the house. He just remembered running. When he reached the street, the fire was already alive, crawling up the side of the building like it had been waiting for this moment. The windows burst with heat. His books, his father's books, crumbled into embers. And standing nearby, just at the edge of the scene, were 2 silhouettes in blue. Officer Mathers and the same partner. No urgency, no concern, just idle conversation and laughter, their eyes lit by the glow of destruction. Jamal stumbled forward, disbelief swallowing his voice. Mathers saw him, walked up slowly, crouched slightly with a half grin. "Careful," he said, his voice mockingly warm. "Wouldn't want to blame us just 'cause you can't keep your place safe." Jamal said nothing. He couldn't. His legs gave way and he sank to the pavement, hands over his face as if to block out the sight, the sound, the smell of everything unraveling. And just across the street, in the stillness of the shadows, a young woman named Kayla stood with her phone pressed firmly in hand. She had seen it all, the laughter, the fire, the collapse. Her lens zoomed in, silent but steady. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just recorded, knowing deep down that this moment needed to be witnessed, because no one would believe it otherwise. The video hit the internet like a spark in dry grass. Within hours, it had spread across every platform, cropped, captioned, and shared by millions who watched in collective disbelief as the fire consumed not only a building, but the illusion of justice. Hashtags surged. #Rivers burning. #Justice for Jamal. #Fire and badge. The footage, Kayla's quiet, steady recording, captured everything. The flames roaring behind Jamal, Officer Mather's cruel laughter, the mocking words, and Jamal collapsed. And crumbling in the street, his grief louder than any protest chant. It wasn't long before the city erupted. Protesters lined the sidewalks holding signs painted with smoke and sorrow. Protect and serve who? One read. Another, you can't burn a legacy. But while the world lit up, Jamal sat in a gray interrogation room under fluorescent lights that buzzed like mosquitoes. They hadn't brought him in as a witness. They hadn't asked how he was doing. They brought him in as a suspect, suggesting he may have torched his own store for attention. He said nothing at first, just stared at the metal table, his fingers laced together, the heat of the fire still clinging to his clothes like a second skin. The officer across from him finally leaned forward and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" Jamal raised his eyes, calm but wounded. "I called for help," he said. "They answered with fire." By the next morning, the press swarmed outside the station. Cameras jostled for position, reporters shouting questions. "Mr. Rivers, do you have a response? To the investigation? Is it true the police let the fire burn? What's your next step?" Jamal stood on the courthouse steps, unsure if he could speak. A microphone was handed to him, and for a moment he stared at it like it was something foreign. The weight of 1,000 eyes pressed against him. But then he remembered his father's voice. "Don't let them write your story for you." He took a breath. "My store," he began, voice trembling, "was never just a business. It was my father's dream, a place for stories, black stories, to be seen and heard. It was a shelter for this community, a space where children came to read and elders came to remember. They tried to burn that." His voice grew steadier, stronger. "But they forgot. We carry our stories with us, and even when the pages turn to ash, the truth remains." The crowd around him erupted in applause, not the loud kind, but the aching kind, the kind that came from hearts cracking open. Mathers, watching from a distance, still wore that familiar smug expression. He had seen public anger before and had always outlasted it. But this time was different. This wasn't just a headline. It was a movement. As national networks picked up the story and the video played on evening news across the country, pressure mounted. The Department of Justice launched an inquiry, citing systemic misconduct and possible criminal negligence. Suddenly, the badge that had once shielded Mathers now magnified the fire behind him. His arrogance began to falter. His smirk faded. The same silence he had weaponized now surrounded him, and this time it spoke louder than he ever could. Just when the flames in the news cycle began to cool, a second video surfaced, this time from inside the very system that had stood so confidently silent. It was body cam footage, clipped and time-stamped, but undeniable. In it, Officer Rick Mathers stood at the scene of the fire, voice clear and cold. "Let it burn. Let the fire department wait." He didn't whisper it. He didn't hesitate. He said it with the ease of someone who never imagined the world would hear. The footage showed him gesturing toward the blaze, laughing with another officer, both turning away as the flames climbed higher. And then came the audio leak, an anonymous file sent to a local journalist. It was raw radio chatter, crackling with static, but the words were chilling. "Let the bookstore roast," Mathers said. "Hope he brought marshmallows." It was a joke to him. Just another night, just another fire, just another black man's life reduced to smoke. The leak came from Officer Elena Soto, a rookie less than a year into the force. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't sign her name, but her conscience spoke where others had been silent. Her courage cracked the foundation of Mather's defense. The city erupted again, but this time with purpose. No longer just outrage, but momentum. Jamal's voice had become a tide. His pain, now echoed by proof, could no longer be brushed aside. In the midst of the chaos, a memory surfaced, one Jamal hadn't thought of in years. A flashback to his childhood, sitting in the bookstore beside his father, listening to stories about the civil rights riots. Walter Rivers had once stood in the exact same neighborhood, fighting to keep the community center from burning when white supremacists hurled Molotov cocktails into black-owned buildings. Jamal remembered the way his father's hands trembled as he told it, not from fear, but from the weight of remembering. They burned the walls, but not the spirit, his father had said. We rebuilt, we always do. It hit Jamal then. This wasn't new. This was history repeating itself, only the uniforms had changed. Inside what remained of Rivers and Sons, scorched walls still held pieces of their past. The only quote that survived the blaze was the one painted above the doorway. In his father's handwriting, you can silence a voice, but never its echo. The ash hadn't touched it. The flames had tried, but failed. That line became more than a relic. It became the rally cry of the movement. Protesters wrote it on signs. Artists painted it on murals. Teachers repeated it in classrooms. It echoed in marches and candlelight vigils. What they burned had only amplified what remained. And now, no badge, no silence, no flame could contain it. The trial didn't come overnight, but accountability finally knocked. Officer Rick Mathers was officially charged with arson-related misconduct, obstruction, and abuse of authority. His badge, once a symbol of untouchable power, was stripped, and he stood before a courtroom not as a protector, but as the man who watched a legacy burn. The community that had once lived under his shadow now stood tall in the light of truth. For Jamal Rivers, justice didn't come as vengeance. It came as a door opening. The city council, under mounting pressure and public support, offered him compensation and a full grant to rebuild what was lost. They expected him to relocate, to move somewhere new and start fresh. But Jamal refused to leave the corner where his father once stood. "This is our soil," he told them, "and we don't abandon our roots when the storm passes." Brick by brick, word by word, Rivers and Sons rose again, but with a new name, the Rising Chapter. The sign above the door gleamed in gold and deep blue, the letters bold and unbroken. The inside bore little resemblance to the old store. It had grown. Walls once lined with quiet shelves now pulsed with color. Murals painted by local artists, honoring Black voices, movements, and ancestors. In the center of the room stood a sculpture, a flame, carved from salvaged wood and polished bronze. It stood tall but warm, not destructive, but illuminating. Beneath it, a plaque read, "They burned pages, but not the story. They broke bricks, but not the roots." Jamal didn't rebuild alone. The community rallied behind him, teenagers and elders laying tiles, organizing books, repainting every inch of what was once ash. Kayla, the young woman who had filmed the viral video, found her voice through the fire. She became a youth leader, organizing workshops for kids, teaching them about activism, storytelling, and how to use their phones not just to scroll, but to speak. Officer Elena Soto, the rookie who chose truth over silence, resigned from the force. She joined a civil rights nonprofit, dedicating her life to restoring trust where institutions had failed. The new store opened with no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no media spectacle, just neighbors holding hands in a circle, breathing in the stillness of survival. Children ran through the aisles again. Elders sat in sunlit corners reading Baldwin and Morrison, and Jamal stood behind the counter, upright, steady, whole. He no longer walked with bowed shoulders. His silence had become strength, not the silence of fear, but of presence, the kind that speaks louder than noise, the kind that tells you, I am still here. Where once there was flame, now stood something unshakable. The rising chapter wasn't just a store, it was proof that truth can rise from ruin, that legacy cannot be erased, and that even when everything burns, the heart of a people remains. They laughed as his store burned, but in the ashes, a voice rose that couldn't be silenced. What began as smoke and cruelty became something larger than any flame. A movement, sparked not by anger alone, but by the quiet resilience of one man who refused to disappear. Jamal's story reminds us that even when the world turns its back, dignity can still stand tall. It reminds us that cameras can be shields, that silence can speak volumes, and that community can rise where justice once fell. Now, we turn to you. Have you ever witnessed injustice and stayed quiet? What would you do if no one else was watching? These questions matter, not just in this story, but in your own. If this moment stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Share it. Tag someone who still believes that truth matters, that accountability isn't optional. And follow us, because stories like these don't just need to be told. They need to be heard. Thank you for walking this path with us. Until the next chapter, stay brave, stay human.